I was only 2 years old when I heard the sound that would change everything. But even now, 23 years later, I can still remember that desperate crying echoing from the darkness below my tiny feet. The memory hits me like a cold wave every time it rains, every time I pass a storm drain, every time I see a child kneeling on wet pavement with their ear pressed to the ground. The storm drain stretched like a concrete mouth beneath the sidewalk, and from somewhere deep inside, a voice was calling for help. A voice that didn't belong to any human. A voice that would teach me what love really meant before I even knew how to tie my shoes. A voice that was growing weaker with each passing hour, though I didn't understand that then. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? Let me take you back to that rainy October morning in 1998, to a small neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, where the smell of wet leaves mixed with something else. Something desperate. Something that made my little heart pound with worry, even though I couldn't understand why. The air was thick with the kind of dampness that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavy and urgent. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how a 2-year-old's curiosity saved a life that nobody else even knew existed. This is the story of how sometimes the smallest voices can hear the biggest cries for help. This is the story of Max, though I didn't know his name then. I didn't know anything except that someone, somewhere in the darkness below my feet, needed me to listen. And I've been listening ever since. I lived in a house painted the color of butter, with my mama, my daddy, and our cat named Whiskers, who always seemed to know when storms were coming hours before the first clouds appeared. The house sat on Maple Street, where the sidewalks cracked like puzzle pieces and dandelions pushed through every gap they could find, creating a pathway of yellow hope that I followed on my daily adventures. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but in the gentlest way possible. Mrs. Henderson next door grew roses that climbed up her fence like they were trying to escape to heaven. Mr. Garcia across the street worked construction, and always had sawdust in his hair that sparkled like gold when the sun hit it just right. The young couple who had moved in last spring was always holding hands when they walked their tiny Yorkie, and they waved at me every time I pressed my face against our front window. Mama always said I was the kind of baby who noticed everything. While other toddlers played with toys, I watched ants march across the kitchen floor in perfect formation, wondering where they were going and what important ant business they had to attend to. While they napped, I pressed my face against windows, studying the way raindrops raced down the glass like they were competing in the Olympics of water. I collected bottle caps that caught my eye with their bright colors and interesting dents. I gathered smooth stones that felt perfect in my small palms. I rescued any injured bug I found in our backyard, bringing them to Mama in my cupped hands with the absolute certainty that she could fix anything that was broken. And she usually could, or at least she made me believe she could, which was the same thing to my 2-year-old heart. Daddy called me his little detective, and it wasn't just because I was curious. I had this way of finding things that were lost. Mama's wedding ring when it slipped down the bathroom drain. Whiskers when he got stuck under the porch and was too proud to meow for help. The neighbor's escaped parakeet that I spotted hiding in our apple tree 3 days after everyone else had given up looking. He'd find me crouched in corners, examining dust particles floating in sunbeams like they held the secrets of the universe, or sitting perfectly still in the backyard while birds landed near my feet, as if they knew I was safe, as if they could sense that I understood the language of small, fragile things. There was something about the quiet, forgotten things that drew me in like a magnet. Maybe that's why I heard what nobody else did that morning. Maybe that's why my heart was already tuned to the frequency of desperation, even though I couldn't have explained what that meant. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the gentle Oregon mist that locals barely notice, but the kind of rain that turns the world gray and makes everything smell like earthworms and old concrete and something deeper, something that speaks of underground rivers and hidden places where water goes to rest. I remember the sound it made against our roof, like thousands of tiny fingers tapping out secrets only I could understand. It drummed against the windows with an urgency that made me feel restless, like there was something important happening just beyond my reach. The gutters sang with a rush of water finding its way downhill, and every storm drain in the neighborhood was working overtime to carry away the Oregon sky. Our neighborhood was old, the kind of place where storm drains were built in the 1960s, wide and deep, designed to carry away the Oregon rains that could flood streets in minutes and turn intersections into temporary lakes. Most people hurried past them without a second glance, umbrellas tilted against the wind, focused on getting wherever they were going as quickly as possible. But I had always been fascinated by those dark openings in the sidewalk, wondering what adventures might be hiding just beyond where the light could reach. I imagined underground kingdoms where the water flowed like rivers between concrete walls, carrying messages from one street to another. I wondered if fish ever got swept into them during big storms, and where they might end up if they did. That morning started like any other rainy day in our house. Mama was making pancakes in the kitchen, the smell of butter and vanilla floating through our little house like a warm hug that wrapped around everything it touched. I could hear the sizzle of batter hitting the pan, the gentle humming she always did when she cooked, a melody that mixed with the rain to create the perfect soundtrack for a cozy morning. Daddy had already left for work at the lumber mill, kissing my forehead and whispering that he'd see me after my nap, his beard scratchy against my cheek and smelling like coffee and the aftershave that Mama had given him for Christmas. He always smelled like sawdust and possibilities, like someone who built things that would last forever. But I wasn't thinking about pancakes or naps or the warm, safe routine of our morning. Something outside was calling to me with a voice I had never heard before but somehow recognized, like an echo of something my heart had been waiting for without knowing it. I pressed my small hands against the living room window, watching the rain create tiny rivers along the street. The water rushed along the curb in miniature rapids, carrying leaves and twigs and bits of debris toward the storm drains that waited like hungry mouths to swallow it all. That's when I first heard it. A sound so faint I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on my imagination. But it came again, and this time, I knew it wasn't the wind at all. It was crying, not the kind of crying that comes from scraped knees or hurt feelings. This was different, desperate, hopeless, like someone had been calling for help for so long they were almost out of voice, almost out of hope, almost out of time. I tugged on Mama's apron while she flipped pancakes, pointing toward the front door with a kind of urgency that only toddlers can muster. She smiled down at me with those warm brown eyes that always made everything feel safe, eyes that could see through any sadness and find the light hiding underneath. "Go look out the window, little bird," she said, using the nickname that always made me feel like I could fly if I wanted to, but stay inside where it's dry. This rain isn't playing around today. But I couldn't just look. That sound was pulling at something deep in my chest, like an invisible string connecting my heart to whatever was out there in the rain. It was the same feeling I got when Whiskers was hurt, or when I found a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. A feeling that said someone needed help. And for some reason, I was the one who was supposed to provide it. I waited until Mama turned back to the stove, humming her cooking song and completely absorbed in creating the perfect golden circles of breakfast happiness. Then I did what any determined 2-year-old would do when faced with a mystery that called to their soul. I climbed onto the couch, my little fingers working at the lock on the front door with the kind of focus that would have impressed a safecrackers, and stepped into the gray morning. The rain immediately soaked through my cotton pajamas, but I didn't care. The cold was shocking at first, but then it became part of the adventure, part of the mission that felt more important than staying warm or dry or following the rules about not going outside without permission. My bare feet slapped against the wet sidewalk as I followed that crying sound, getting louder and more desperate with each step I took. The storm drain was 3 houses down from ours, right in front of Mrs. Henderson's yellow house with the rose bushes that bloomed every spring in explosions of pink and red that made the whole street smell like heaven. I had walked past it hundreds of times during strolls with Mama and Daddy, but I had never heard anything coming from inside it before. It had always been just another part of the landscape, another piece of the infrastructure that adults had built to keep water from flooding our streets. But now it was something else entirely. Now it was the source of the most heartbreaking sound I had ever heard. I knelt down on the cold concrete, my little knees instantly soaking through my cotton pajamas, the chill seeping into my bones and making me shiver. But the shivers weren't just from the cold. They were from the urgency of what I was hearing, from the knowledge that something terrible was happening just a few feet below where I knelt. The metal grate was heavy and dark, with bars thick enough that only the smallest things could slip through. But the sound was definitely coming from down there, echoing up from the darkness like a ghost calling for help, like a prayer being whispered in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. "Hello," I whispered into the drain, my voice barely audible over the rain that continued to fall with increasing intensity. The crying stopped for a moment, as if whatever was down there had heard me and was listening, holding its breath and hoping that help had finally arrived. Then it started again, more urgent this time, more hopeful, more desperate. It was a sound that said, "Please don't leave me. Please don't give up on me. Please don't let me disappear into this darkness alone." I pressed my face closer to the grate, trying to see past the black emptiness below, my cheek against the cold metal that smelled like rain and rust, and something deeper, something that spoke of underground places where water rushed toward unknown destinations. The bars were too close together for me to stick my head through, but I could get my face close enough to peer into the shadows. That's when I caught a glimpse of something that made my breath catch in my throat, and my heart start pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. 2 eyes, reflecting what little light managed to filter down into that concrete tunnel. Eyes that looked up at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that I somehow understood, even at 2 years old. Eyes that belonged to someone who had been waiting for what felt like forever for someone, anyone, to notice they were there. They were the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen, even in the darkness, even filled with terror and exhaustion, and the kind of hopelessness that comes from being trapped in a place where no one thinks to look. They were eyes that said, "I'm still here, I'm still fighting, I'm still hoping that someone will care enough to help me." "Don't worry," I whispered into the darkness, my small voice carrying all the conviction that a 2-year-old heart could hold. "I'm going to help you. I don't know how yet, but I'm not going to leave you down there alone." I didn't know how. I didn't know if I even could. But something deep inside me, some instinct that had nothing to do with age or experience, told me that whoever was down there needed me. And I wasn't going to let them down. I was going to figure out a way to save them, even if I had to get every adult in the neighborhood to help me do it. Because that's what you do when someone needs you. You don't walk away. You don't pretend you didn't hear. You don't assume that someone else will take care of it. You stay. You fight. You refuse to give up. Even if you're only 2 years old and wearing soggy pajamas and have no idea what you're doing. Especially then. The eyes belong to a dog. Even in the murky darkness of the storm drain, I could make out the shape of a German shepherd, soaked and shivering, pressed against the far wall of the concrete tunnel like he was trying to become one with the shadows. The water level had risen from days of relentless rain, reaching almost to the dog's chest, and I could see him struggling to keep his beautiful head above the cold, rushing current that threatened to pull him under with every passing second. He was magnificent, even in his desperate state. His coat was a mix of black and tan, though it was matted with mud and debris and streaked with the grime of whatever journey had brought him to this underground prison. but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to speak directly to my heart. A wisdom that said this wasn't just any stray dog wandering the streets. This was someone's companion, someone's best friend, someone's family member trapped in a nightmare that nobody else had noticed. How long had he been down there? The question burned in my mind as I stared into those pleading eyes. How had he even gotten inside? The grate above was too heavy for a dog to lift, especially one that was already exhausted and fighting for his life. The bars were too narrow for anything larger than a cat to squeeze through. But somehow, this magnificent creature had ended up in the worst possible place, in a concrete tomb where the water was rising higher every hour and nobody could hear his cries for help. Nobody except me. I could see the exhaustion written in every line of his body. His beautiful head kept dipping toward the water, then jerking back up as he fought to stay conscious, fought to keep breathing, fought to maintain hope that rescue would come before it was too late. His paws scraped against the smooth concrete walls, trying to find purchase, trying to climb to safety, but there was nothing to grip, nothing to hold on to, nothing to save him except the hope that someone would hear his cries before the water rose too high. And the water was rising. I could see it creeping higher up his chest with each minute that passed, each drop of rain that fell adding to the flood that was slowly but surely claiming his life. The current was strong too, strong enough that I could see him struggling to maintain his footing on the slippery concrete floor. If he lost his balance, if he got swept away by that rushing water, he would disappear into the underground tunnels that connected storm drain to storm drain, and no one would ever find him. The rain was getting heavier, which meant the water in the drain was rising faster. I watched in horror as it crept higher up his chest, and I realized with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in crisis that this dog was going to drown if somebody didn't do something right now. Not in an hour, not when the rain stopped, not when the grown-ups figured out what to do. Right now. But what could a 2-year-old do? I couldn't lift the heavy metal grate that covered the drain. I couldn't climb down into that rushing water without getting swept away myself. I couldn't even reach him if I tried. My arms were too short, my body too small, my strength too limited to make any difference in this impossible situation. That's when I heard Mama calling my name from our front porch, her voice sharp with worry and rising panic. She had discovered I was missing, and from the sound of it, she was starting to imagine all the terrible things that could happen to a toddler who had wandered off in the rain. Sarah! Sarah! Where are you? Come inside right now. I looked back toward our house, where warmth and safety and pancakes were waiting for me. Then I looked down at the dog whose life was literally slipping away with each passing minute, whose eyes were fixed on my face with the kind of desperate hope that said, "You're my only chance. Please don't leave me here to die alone." I had to make a choice that felt impossibly huge for someone who still needed help reaching the kitchen counter. I had to decide whether to run back to the safety of my mama's arms or stay here with this stranger who needed me more than anyone had ever needed me before. I chose the dog. Instead of running back to Mama's safety, instead of obeying the voice that was calling me home, I started screaming. Not the tantrum kind of screaming that toddlers are famous for. Not the whining that comes from being told no or being asked to share toys. This was different. This was the kind of screaming that comes from pure desperation, from the knowledge that a life hangs in the balance and every second counts. The kind that cuts through rain and wind and reaches into people's hearts with urgent fingers. Help! I screamed toward every house on the street, my small voice carrying farther than it should have been able to, powered by an urgency that gave it strength. Help! There's a doggy! He's stuck! He's going to die! Help him! I screamed until my throat was raw, until my voice cracked, until I was sure that everyone in a 3-block radius could hear me. I screamed because that beautiful dog couldn't scream for himself. I screamed because sometimes the only way to save someone is to make enough noise that the whole world stops what they're doing and pays attention. I screamed because love demanded it. My screaming brought Mama running faster than I had ever seen her move, her slippers splashing through puddles as she raced toward me with her bathrobe flying behind her like a superhero cape. When she saw me kneeling by the storm drain, soaked to the bone and crying and pointing frantically at the metal grate, her face went through about 6 different expressions in 2 seconds. First came relief that I was safe and not lying broken in the street. Then came anger that I had scared her half to death by disappearing without permission. Then came confusion about what I was doing kneeling in the rain next to a storm drain. Then came understanding as she got close enough to hear what I had been hearing. "Sarah Elizabeth, what are you doing out here? You scared me half to death. I thought you had been kidnapped or hit by a car or..." But then she heard it too, the weak whimpering coming from below, barely audible over the sound of rushing water and falling rain. Her whole demeanor changed in an instant, from worried mother to someone who understood that we were dealing with an emergency. "Oh my God," she whispered, kneeling beside me in the puddle that was forming around the storm drain and peering into the darkness with wide eyes. "There's a dog down there. Sarah, how did you even hear that?" "He's drowning, Mama," I sobbed, pointing down at those beautiful, desperate eyes that were still fixed on us with fading hope. "We have to save him. We have to get him out of there." Mama's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. She had always been the kind of person who rescued injured birds and brought home stray cats, much to Daddy's pretend annoyance. She was the one who stopped traffic to help turtles cross the road, and who kept a first aid kit in her car in case she came across an accident. Seeing an animal in distress transformed her from worried mother into determined rescuer in about 3 seconds. "Stay right here, baby," she told me, already running toward Mrs. Henderson's house with purpose in every step. "Don't move from this spot, and don't try to reach into that drain. I'm going to get help." She pounded on Mrs. Henderson's door with both fists, then rang the doorbell repeatedly until the elderly woman appeared in her quilted robe and curlers, ready to scold whoever was making such a racket so early in the morning. But when she saw Mama's face, when she heard the urgency in her voice, her expression immediately shifted to concern. Then she was running to Mr. Garcia's house, then to the young couple who had just moved in across the street, her voice carrying across the wet morning air as she called for help. Within minutes, half the neighborhood was standing around the storm drain in their bathrobes and rain jackets and whatever shoes they had been able to grab on their way out the door. Mrs. Henderson arrived with an umbrella that she immediately held over me, muttering about babies catching their cold. Mr. Garcia showed up with a toolbox and a headlamp, ready to solve whatever problem required solving. The young couple brought their cell phone, already dialing what I would later learn was 911. Even Mr. Thompson from 2 streets over had heard the commotion and come to see what was happening. Within 10 minutes, we had a crowd of adults all peering into the storm drain and trying to figure out how to save a dog that none of us had even known existed. Mr. Garcia, who worked construction and understood things like water flow and structural engineering, took one look at the situation and shook his head grimly. "That grate's got to weigh 60 pounds, maybe more. And even if we get it off, that water's moving too fast. It's not safe for anyone to go down there. We need to wait for the fire department." But Mrs. Henderson, who was 78 years old and tougher than most people half her age, wasn't hearing any of that negativity. She marched back to her house with determination in every step and returned with a crowbar, a flashlight, and the kind of fierce resolve that could have moved mountains. "That dog's been crying for help, and this little angel heard him when nobody else did," she said, nodding toward me with a kind of respect usually reserved for war heroes. "We're not going to let him die because it's inconvenient or dangerous. Sometimes you have to take risks to do what's right." The young couple from across the street had called the fire department and was giving them our exact address. But we all knew they might not arrive in time. Emergency services were probably dealing with flooding and accidents all over the city. A dog in a storm drain might not be their highest priority, even though it was the most important thing in the world to those of us standing in the rain. The water was still rising. I could see it creeping higher up the dog's chest, and his head was starting to dip more frequently toward the surface. He was getting weaker, getting tired, getting closer to the point where he wouldn't be able to fight anymore. That's when Mama surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm small enough," she announced, studying the opening with the calculating look she got when she was solving a difficult problem. "If you can lift that grate and hold it, I can get down there. I'm probably the only one here who can fit through that opening." "Absolutely not," said Mr. Garcia, his voice firm with the authority of someone who had seen too many construction accidents. "That current will sweep you away in seconds. You'll both end up drowning. And then what good will we have done?" But Mama was already kicking off her slippers and tying her hair back with the hair elastic she always kept around her wrist. She looked down at me with those fierce, protective eyes that mothers get when something needs saving, when love demands action regardless of the risk. "Sometimes, baby," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that moves the world, "you have to be brave for someone who can't be brave for themselves." It took 4 grown men to lift that metal grate, their faces straining with effort as they slowly raised it from the opening like they were lifting the lid off a concrete coffin. Mr. Garcia, Mr. Thompson, the young man from across the street whose name I didn't even know, and even old Mr. Peterson who had heard the commotion from his morning walk and stopped to help. The sound of rushing water immediately got louder, and we could all see just how fast that current was moving. It looked like an underground river determined to carry away anything that dared to challenge it. A force of nature that had no patience for human intervention or canine lives, or the desperate plans of neighbors who had decided that today they were going to fight physics and win. Mama sat on the edge of the opening, her legs dangling into the darkness like she was about to jump into the deep end of the world's most dangerous swimming pool. Mrs. Henderson held the flashlight, creating a circle of light that barely reached the bottom of the drain, but illuminated enough for us to see the full scope of what we were dealing with. In that pale glow, we could all see him clearly now. The German Shepherd was magnificent, even in his desperate state. He had to be at least 80 pounds of pure muscle and fur, with intelligent brown eyes that never left Mama's face as she prepared to climb down to him. His ears were alert despite his exhaustion, and something in his expression suggested he understood that help was finally coming, that these strange humans gathered around his prison were here to save him, not hurt him. But he was also clearly in trouble. The water was up to his chest now, and I could see him shivering from the cold. His breathing was labored, and there were small wounds on his legs where he had been scraping against the concrete walls trying to climb out. He had been fighting for his life for hours, maybe days, and his strength was almost gone. "It's okay, boy," Mama called down to him, her voice gentle despite the fear I could hear underneath it, the terror she was trying to hide from all of us. "I'm coming to get you. Just hold on a little bit longer." She lowered herself into the drain slowly, testing each foothold on the concrete walls like a rock climber descending into an underground canyon. The water immediately soaked her pajama pants, and I could see her body tense as the cold hit her, as the current tugged at her legs, trying to knock her off balance before she could even reach the dog. But she kept moving, inch by careful inch, her hands gripping the sides of the drain opening while her feet searched for stable places to stand in the rushing water. The flashlight beam followed her descent, creating crazy shadows that danced on the concrete walls like ghosts cheering her on. The dog watched her approach with a mixture of hope and caution. He was clearly exhausted, but some survival instinct kept him alert as this stranger waded through dangerous water to reach him. His tail gave one small, tentative wag, as if he was afraid to hope too much, but couldn't help feeling grateful that someone had finally heard his cries. "Easy, baby," Mama whispered, extending her hand toward him slowly, the way you approach any frightened animal. "I'm here to help. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog sniffed her hand carefully, then pressed his wet nose against her palm in a gesture of trust that made my heart squeeze tight in my chest. Even in his desperation, even faced with a complete stranger, he somehow knew that she was there to save him. But as she got closer, we all realized the real problem. The dog wasn't just trapped by the rising water and the smooth concrete walls. He was actually stuck, his collar somehow tangled around a piece of rebar or pipe that jutted out from the drain wall. He had been fighting against it for hours, maybe days, and now he was too weak to break free on his own. His collar stuck. Mama called up to us, her voice echoing strangely in the concrete tunnel. "I need something to cut it with. Something sharp." Mr. Garcia disappeared without a word and returned with a utility knife, the kind that construction workers use to cut through everything from rope to roofing materials. He lowered it down to Mama on a piece of rope, moving carefully to make sure she could grab it without losing her balance in the current. But the water was moving so fast, and the space was so cramped, that getting close enough to cut the collar meant putting herself in serious danger. The current was trying to knock her off her feet with every step, and if she lost her balance, she would get swept away into the underground tunnels that connected storm drain to storm drain across the city. That's when the dog did something that still gives me chills 23 years later. He stopped struggling, completely, as if he understood that Mama was risking her life to save him, and the least he could do was stay perfectly still to make her job easier. His eyes never left her face as she worked the knife under his collar, sawing through the thick leather while the current tried to knock them both off their feet. It was like he knew they were a team now, like he understood that his survival depended on her courage, and her safety depended on his cooperation. So he held perfectly still, trusting the stranger with his life, while she fought against time and water and physics to set him free. The rain kept falling, the water kept rising, and somewhere above ground, the sound of sirens was getting closer. The collar snapped just as we heard the sirens getting louder, the fire department finally arriving after what felt like hours, but had probably only been 20 minutes. But Mama and the dog weren't waiting for an official rescue. They had their own plan, their own partnership forged in those desperate moments in the darkness. The moment he was free, that beautiful German shepherd did something that surprised everyone. Instead of trying to escape, instead of scrambling away from the human who had just invaded his space, he pressed himself against Mama's side, not trying to get away, but actually helping her maintain balance against the current that was trying to sweep them both away. It was like he knew they were a team now, like he understood that getting out of this concrete tomb was going to require both of them working together, trusting each other, depending on each other in ways that went beyond species and language and everything that usually separates humans from animals. Getting out was going to be harder than getting in. The dog was heavy, probably close to 90 pounds of waterlogged fur and muscle, and the concrete walls were slippery with rain and moss and years of accumulated grime. The opening above seemed impossibly far away, and the current was getting stronger as more rain fell and more water rushed into the storm drain system. But Mrs. Henderson had thought ahead, lowering down a rope that Mama could loop around the dog's chest. It was the kind of rope that mountain climbers use, strong enough to hold much more weight than one exhausted German shepherd, but getting it positioned correctly while standing waist-deep in rushing water was going to be a challenge. "We're going to pull you up, boy," Mama told him, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, despite the cold water and the slippery walls and the very real possibility that this rescue attempt could go wrong in a dozen different ways. "But you have to trust us. You have to let us help you." And he did. This dog who had been trapped and terrified, who had every reason to panic, who had been fighting for his life in the darkness for who knows how long, stayed calm as 6 neighbors worked together to lift him out of what could have been his grave. The firefighters arrived just as we were positioning the rope, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles as they assessed the situation with professional eyes. But instead of taking over, instead of pushing the civilians out of the way and implementing some official rescue protocol, they saw what we had already accomplished and decided to help rather than interfere. "You folks are doing great," the fire captain said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of emergency situations. "Let's just make sure everyone gets out safe." Mr. Garcia and 2 other men hauled on the rope, while Mama guided the dog's paws to spots where he could help push himself up. It was a slow process, complicated by the fact that the dog was exhausted and the walls were slippery, and every few seconds the current would surge and threaten to knock everyone off balance. But inch by inch, he rose toward the light. His beautiful head appeared first, then his shoulders, then his powerful chest as the neighborhood team worked together to save a life that nobody had even known was in danger an hour earlier. When his head finally emerged above the rim of the storm drain, the whole crowd of neighbors and firefighters let out a cheer that probably woke everyone within 3 blocks. But I'll never forget his expression as he looked around at all these strangers who had dropped everything to save his life. His eyes were wide with wonder and exhaustion, and something that looked a lot like gratitude. His tail gave one small, grateful wag before he collapsed onto the sidewalk, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that he had been fighting for so long. The paramedics who had arrived with the fire truck wanted to check Mama for hypothermia, but she waved them off, more concerned about the dog than herself. Her lips were blue from the cold water, and her hands were shaking, but all her attention was focused on the beautiful creature who lay panting on the wet concrete. "He needs a vet," she told them, kneeling beside him and running her hands over his fur to check for injuries. "He's been in that water for hours, maybe longer. He needs medical attention right away." But when they tried to load him into their truck to transport him to the emergency animal hospital, something unexpected happened. The dog, exhausted as he was, refused to go. He planted himself right next to me, his wet fur pressed against my little body, and looked up at Mama with eyes that clearly said he wasn't going anywhere without us. He had decided, somewhere in that underground darkness, that we were his people now, that the little girl who had heard his cries and the woman who had risked her life to save him were his family, and families stick together. "I guess we're coming too," Mama laughed, scooping me up in her arms while the dog pressed close to both of us. And that's how our family grew by 4 paws and one enormous heart in the space of a single rainy morning. Dr. Martinez at the emergency animal clinic said it was a miracle on 4 legs. The dog was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from mild hypothermia, but he had no serious injuries beyond some scrapes and cuts from his struggle against the concrete walls. More importantly, he was young and strong, probably only about 2 years old himself, with the kind of constitution that could bounce back from almost anything given proper care and love. "He's going to be fine," Dr. Martinez told us as we sat in the waiting room, me curled up in Mama's lap while our new friend slept off his ordeal in a warm kennel lined with soft blankets. "His vital signs are strong, his heart rate is good, and there's no sign of internal injuries. But I have to ask, whose dog is this? Someone must be worried sick about him." That was the question that had been nagging at all of us since the moment we pulled him from that storm drain. How does a beautiful, well-built German Shepherd end up trapped underground with no one looking for him? Where was his family? Why hadn't anyone reported him missing? Nobody knew. We had spent the afternoon calling every animal shelter, veterinary clinic, and rescue organization in the county. Mama had even convinced Mr. Garcia to help her post flyers around the neighborhood with the dog's picture, asking if anyone recognized him or knew where he belonged. But nobody claimed him. Nobody even reported him missing. It was as if he had materialized in that storm drain out of thin air, like a furry angel sent specifically for me to find. The more we learned about his situation, the sadder it became. Dr. Martinez found evidence that he had been on his own for weeks, maybe longer. He was underweight despite his strong build, and his paws showed signs of walking on rough surfaces for extended periods. Someone had abandoned him, or lost him, or simply stopped caring about his welfare. But there was something else Dr. Martinez discovered that changed everything. The dog was microchipped. Somewhere under his fur was a tiny piece of technology that could tell us exactly who he belonged to and how he had ended up in our neighborhood storm drain. When they scanned him, when they pulled up his information on their computer, the story became even more heartbreaking. His name was Max, and he had been reported stolen 3 months earlier from a family that lived 200 miles away. The chip showed that his original owners had been desperately searching for him, posting on social media and working with police and animal control, but they had never thought to look in Portland. Someone had stolen Max from his yard, probably to sell him or use him for breeding, then abandoned him when he became too much trouble. He had been on his own ever since, wandering the streets and searching for a way home, until that storm system trapped him in the one place where only a 2-year-old detective would think to listen. Dr. Martinez made the call to Max's original family while we waited in the exam room. I could hear the joy and relief in their voices, even from across the room, when they learned that their beloved companion had been found alive and well. But then came the conversation that would change all of our lives. When Daddy came home from work and heard the story, when he learned about my mysterious ability to hear a dog crying from underground when nobody else noticed, when he saw the way Max had bonded with our family in the space of a single day, he just shook his head and smiled. Of course our Sarah would hear a dog crying from underground when nobody else noticed, he said, his voice full of the kind of pride that made my chest swell with warmth. And of course your mama would climb down into a storm drain to save him. That's the kind of people we are. But what he said next surprised everyone. So what are we going to do when his real family comes to get him? That question hung in the air like a weight that none of us wanted to carry. We had saved Max's life, but he belonged to someone else. Someone who had been searching for him, someone who loved him, someone who had the legal right to take him home. But Max had other ideas. When his original family arrived the next day, when they walked into Dr. Martinez's office with tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces, Max did something that surprised everyone. He was happy to see them. His tail wagged, and he accepted their hugs and tears, and it was clear that he remembered them and had missed them. But when they tried to lead him toward their car, when they tried to take him home to the life he had been stolen from, he planted his feet and refused to move. Instead, he walked over to me, pressed his enormous head against my little body, and looked up at his original family with eyes that clearly said, "I love you, but this is my pack now." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and beautiful things I had ever witnessed. Max's original family loved him enough to recognize that he had found something special with us, something that went beyond ownership or legal rights or who had the better claim. In the end, they made a decision that showed the true meaning of love. They decided that Max belonged where he was happiest, with the little girl who had heard his cries for help and the woman who had risked her life to save him. That's how Max came to live with us permanently, not through adoption paperwork or legal transfers, but through the simple recognition that some bonds are stronger than ownership, that some families are chosen rather than born, and that love sometimes means letting go so that everyone can find their proper place in the world. Max's original family visited him regularly for the first few months, bringing toys and treats and updates on their lives. But it became clear to everyone that he had found his true home with us, the family that had pulled him from the darkness and welcomed him into the light. Growing up with Max was like having a furry guardian angel who never let me out of his sight and always seemed to know what I needed before I needed it myself. He walked me to the school bus every morning and was waiting at the same spot every afternoon. His tail wagging with a kind of joy that suggested my return was the best part of his entire day. He somehow knew the difference between friends who were welcome in our yard and strangers who needed to be watched carefully. Kids from the neighborhood learned that Max was friendly but protective, that he would let you pet him and play with him, but would place himself between you and me if he sensed any aggression or roughness. But more than that, Max taught me things that no human ever could. Lessons about life and love and loyalty that shaped who I became as I grew from toddler to child to teenager to young adult. He taught me that love doesn't require words. Every morning, he would rest his massive head on my bed and look at me with eyes that said everything I needed to know about devotion and loyalty, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that makes you feel like the most important person in the world. When I was sad, he would press his warm body against mine and stay there for as long as I needed him, his steady breathing and solid presence more comforting than any words could have been. When I was excited, he would bounce around the yard with me, his joy matching mine beat for beat, as if my happiness was his happiness and there was no separation between us. He taught me that being different was not only okay, it was something to be proud of. Max had a small scar on his nose from his time in the storm drain, and kids at school sometimes asked about it. But I learned to tell them proudly that it was his badge of courage, proof that he was a survivor who had fought to live and won. Some people thought it was strange that a little girl would have such a close bond with such a large dog. But Max and I understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with size or species or the usual boundaries that separate different kinds of beings. He taught me that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose. Max chose us that day when he refused to leave my side after his rescue, and we chose him right back. It wasn't about paperwork or legal ownership or who had the stronger claim. It was about love and loyalty, and the recognition that some bonds are deeper than law or logic. As I grew older, people would ask me if I really remembered that day when I was 2 years old. How could I possibly remember something from when I was so young? But I remembered every detail with a clarity that never faded. The smell of the rain, the sound of his crying, the look in his eyes when he realized help was coming, the feeling of his wet fur against my cheek when we finally brought him home. Some memories are too important to forget. Some experiences shape you so completely that they become part of who you are at the deepest level. Finding Max, saving Max, being chosen by Max, these weren't just things that happened to me. They were the foundation of everything I would become. Max lived with us for 15 beautiful years. 15 years of walks through the neighborhood where everyone knew his story and stopped to pet him and tell me how proud they were of what our family had done. 15 years of him sleeping at the foot of my bed. Even when I grew up and moved away for college, coming home to find him still waiting in my old room like a faithful sentinel guarding my childhood.
15 years of him teaching me that heroes coming as chaps and saisis. That the most important thing you can do in this world is listen for voices that others meet me. And that love is the strongest force in the universe when it's combined with action and care and the refusal to give up on someone who needs you. When Max was 17 years old, his body finally started to show his age. His hips had from all those years of playing fetch and running through the yard and humping up to greet everyone who came to visit. His eyes got cloudy, and couldn't hear as well as Useto, but his heart was still strong, and his love for all family never wavered. Dr. Martinez, the same vet who had treated him after his rescue 15 years earlier, said Max had lived longer than most German shepherds. Accredited it to the love in our home, to the care we had given him, to the bond that has stand him through everything from puppyhood to old age. But he knew better. Max had lived solo me causea da hope todo, taking care of the little girl who had heard his cries when nobody else called, protecting the family that had pulled him from the darkness, repaying a debt of love that could never really be repaid but could be honored every single day. The day we had to say goodbye to Max was the hardest day of mine in a 10-year-old life, but also the most beautiful in what I never could have expected. But even in his final moments, it taught me one last lesson about love and letting go and the way that true bonds transcend the physical world. We held him at the vet's office, Mama and Daddy and me, our hands stroking his soft fur as Dr. Martinez helped him cross over peacefully. The same clinic where a van brought after his rescue. The same gentle hands that are nursing back to Earth, now helping him transition from this life to whatever comes next. His last act was to lick my hand. He stand laughing warm against my palm, as if it was saying thank you for hearing me that rainy day so many years ago. Thank you for not walking away. Thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Thank you for giving me a family and a purpose and 15 years of love that made every moment of suffering worthwhile. We buried him in our backyard, under the oak tree where we sat to lie in the summer sun, watching squirrels and greeting neighbors and keeping an eye on all the small dramas that make up the daily life of a family. Daddy made a hast on that Max, hero, guardian, family. Vari nu de real memorial to Max Gulby the way a channel our arts, the way a taught was to listen for voices that others meet miss. After college, I became a veterinary myself, following a path that a ben laid out for me by a to this instinct to help on the dog's desperate need for rescue. Dr. Martinez a retired, and he talked over his practice, the same clinic where Max had been treated after his rescue, where his story became legendary among the staff and clients who remembered that rainy day when a neighborhood came together to save a life. Every day, I get to help animals the way our neighborhood helped Max that rainy morning. Every day, I see the bond between humans and animals, the way that love transcends species and creates families that are stronger than biology or any of the artificial boundaries that people try to create. But the most important thing Max taught me is still with me every single day, the importance of listening for voices that others meet miss, of paying attention to the forgotten and the abandoned and the lost, of refusing to walk away when someone needs help even if helping seems impossible. Last month, a little boy brought in a kitten and found in a dumpster bin in his apartment complex. The kitten was teeny, barely old enough to be away from its mother, and nobody understood how this 4-year-old even heard its weak moving from inside all that trash and debris. But he understood. He looked at that little boy, so determined to save something smaller and more helpless than himself, so certain that the adults around would know how to fix whatever was wrong, and he saw myself at 2 years old, kneeling by a storm drawn in the rain. Some people are born to hear the voices of those who cannot speak for themselves. Some people are born to notice the forgotten, the abandoned, the lost. Some people have ears that are attuned to the frequency of desperation and hope, that can detect the faintest cry for help even when it's coming from the darkest places. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those people are only 2 years old, with bare feet and pajamas, standing in the rain because they are in trouble carried out to theirs. The kitten lived. We nursed him back to Earth, found him a loving home with a family that understood what a gift they were receiving. But more importantly, that little boy learned the same lesson he had learned at 2 years ago, that his voice mattered, that his compassion could change lives, that the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward in what's in the very mind. In a made the kitten Max. I'd love to know, what team is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Because wherever you are, at whatever team you're hearing this story, I want you to know that there are voices calling out right now. Voices of animals who need help, voices of people who feel forgotten, voices of those who are trapped in their own storm drowns, waiting for someone to hear them. Maybe you're that someone. Maybe you're the person who will stop and listen when others walk by. Maybe you're the one who will kneel down in the rain and call into the darkness. Don't worry, I'm going to help you. Maybe you're the one who will refuse to accept that someone else will take care of it, that it's not your responsibility, that you're too small or too young or too powerless to make a difference. Because here is what I learned from that running morning 23 years ago. We don't have to be big to make a big difference. We don't have to be strong to be some own strengths. We don't have to have all the answers to be exactly the answer someone needs. We don't have to be adults to act with the kind of care that changes lives. Sometimes all we have to do is listen. Really listen. With our hearts as well as our ears, for the voices that others meet miss. Sometimes all we have to do is care. Care enough to get uncomfortable, to get wet, to risk looking foolish or dramatic or overly emotional. Sometimes all we have to do is refuse to walk away when someone needs us to stay. Refuse to assume that someone else will handle it. Refuse to accept that there is nothing we can do. Max lived for 17 years because a 2-year-old heard him crying and decided it mattered. He filled our home with love, protected our family, and taught us that the most important thing you can do in this world is notice when someone needs help and then actually help them. And now, every teammate rains, I still think of him. I still remember the sound of his voice calling from the darkness, and the way his eyes lit up when I realized I wasn't there alone anymore. I remember the weight of his head on my lap during thunderstorms, the way Gul pressed against me when he was sad, the absolute truth in his eyes when he looked at me. But most of all, I remember the lesson it taught me about listening, about paying attention, about being the kind of person who hears the voices that others miss.
None of us have to be alone. There's always someone listening. Even when we think nobody cares, there's always someone willing to climb down into the storm drain of our worst moments and help us find our way back to the light. And sometimes, if we're very blessed, that someone has 4 legs, a tail that never stops wagging, and a heart big enough to love us for the rest of our lives. That's the magic of rescue. You think you're saving them, but really, they're saving you. They're teaching you about love and loyalty and courage, and the way that small acts of kindness can echo through decades. Max saved us all. He saved me from growing up without understanding what real love looks like. He saved Mama from thinking she wasn't brave enough to do extraordinary things. He saved our family from being just a family instead of being a pack, a team, a group of beings who would do anything for each other. And somewhere out there, right now, another voice is calling from another storm drain, waiting for another 2-year-old with a heart brave enough to listen. I hope that 2-year-old is you. I hope you're ready to get your feet wet, to kneel down in the rain, to refuse to walk away when someone needs you to stay. I hope you're ready to save someone, and in doing so, let them save you right back. Because that's how love works. That's how families are made. That's how ordinary moments become extraordinary memories that last a lifetime. Listen carefully. Someone needs you today.